The radio crackled with static as Lieutenant Colonel Kira, Raven, Volkov adjusted her headset, her weathered hands moving with practiced precision across the controls of the F-16C Fighting Falcon. At 43, she'd been relegated to what the younger pilots called milk runs, routine training flights that kept her out of the way while the hotshots grabbed the glory missions. The brass had made it clear. Her time was almost up. Raven 17, this is Tower. You're cleared for standard pattern work. Try not to embarrass yourself out there. The controller's voice carried that familiar tone of condescension she'd grown accustomed to over the past year. Young Lieutenant Morrison, fresh from the academy, probably thought he was being clever. She keyed her mic with deliberate calm. Tower Raven 17, copy standard pattern work, and Morrison, she paused, letting the silence stretch. Watch and learn. The morning sun painted the Nevada desert in shades of gold and copper as Kira pushed the throttle forward. The General Electric F-110 engine responded with a thunderous roar that she felt in her bones. 22 years of flying military aircraft, from the T-6 Texan Trainer to the A-10 Warthog in Afghanistan, and she still felt that surge of pure adrenaline when the afterburner kicked in. What the younger pilots didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that experience wasn't just about flight hours. It was about the thousand small moments when muscle memory and instinct meant the difference between coming home and becoming a statistic. The way the stick felt in your hands when hydraulics started failing. The subtle change in engine harmonics that preceded catastrophic failure. The weight of responsibility that settled on your shoulders when lives hung in the balance. Jesus, look at that old bird fly, she heard someone mutter over the radio. They'd forgotten to switch channels. Morrison, why's she even still up there? Isn't she like 50 or something? Kira smiled grimly as she banked left into a perfect knife-edge pass over the runway. The F-16 responded to her touch like a finely tuned instrument, every input translated into graceful motion through the crystalline desert air. She'd been flying before these kids were born, had logged more combat hours than most of them had total flight time. But in their eyes, she was just another relic taking up space. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 hours from now, when the real emergency began, these same voices would be begging for her help. When mechanical failure turned routine training into a fight for survival, when the textbook answers fell apart and only raw skill and experience mattered, they'd learn what too old really meant. But for now, she was just Raven, flying patterns in the desert while the world forgot she existed. The desert stretched endlessly below as Kira completed her third traffic pattern, the familiar rhythm of takeoff, climb, turn, and landing, almost meditative in its precision. Each maneuver was flawless, executed with the kind of unconscious competence that came from 2 decades of pushing aircraft to their limits. Yet she knew that to the observers on the ground, she was merely going through the motions. Raven 1-7, extend your downwind for incoming traffic. Morrison's voice crackled through her headset. She could hear the barely concealed annoyance. Even in simple pattern work, they found ways to make her wait, to remind her of her place in the pecking order. Copy, extending downwind. She banked gently to the left, giving way to a newer F-35 Lightning II that screamed past her with all the subtlety of a teenager showing off. The pilot, call sign Viper, was barely 25, all swagger and afterburner. She tried to mentor him once, sharing hard-won lessons about energy management and situational awareness. He listened politely, then ignored every word. The F-35 pilot's voice filled the radio frequency, young and cocky. Tower, Viper 2-3 requesting closed pattern. Time to show these old-timers how it's done. Kira's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained steady. Raven 1-7, continuing extended downwind. She'd learned long ago that dignity was often the only weapon left when everything else had been stripped away. The young pilot saw weakness where she saw restraint, confusion where she saw complexity. Below, the sprawling complex of Nelly's Air Force Base stretched across the desert floor like a miniature city. Hangars gleamed in the morning sun, their massive doors open to reveal the sleeping forms of F-22 Raptors and F-15 Eagles. Ground crews moved with purposeful efficiency, preparing aircraft for the day's missions. It was a world she'd once belonged to without question, where her presence commanded respect and her voice carried weight. Now she was a curiosity, a reminder of an older generation that the service was eager to pension off. The official reason was always budgetary constraints, force restructuring, the need to make room for fresh talent. But she knew the real reason. She made them uncomfortable. Her competence was a quiet rebuke to their assumptions about age and capability. Raven 1-7, cleared for final approach, Morrison announced, his tone suggesting he was doing her a favor. As she turned onto final approach, Kira caught sight of her reflection in the canopy glass. Gray streaks threaded through her dark hair, and lines mapped the corners of her eyes, evidence of countless hours squinting into hostile skis. But her hands were steady, her reactions sharp. The years had taken their toll on her body, but her mind remained as keen as ever. The F-16 touched down with barely a whisper, main gear kissing the runway with the kind of precision that made landing look effortless. She'd performed this same maneuver thousands of times, but it never lost its satisfaction. What she didn't know was that in exactly 2 hours and 37 minutes, a catastrophic systems failure would test every skill she'd ever learned, every instinct she'd ever developed. The desert was about to become her crucible. Colonel James Hawk Brennan stood in the control tower, his weathered face etched with the kind of permanent concern that came from 30 years of military service. At 56, he'd seen enough crashes, enough failures, enough young pilots who thought they were invincible right up until the moment they weren't. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he watched Kira's F-16 taxi clear of the runway with characteristic precision. "Sir, why do we keep letting her fly?" Lieutenant Morrison's question carried the casual arrogance of youth. "I mean, she's got to be hitting mandatory retirement soon anyway." Hawk's eyes never left the aircraft as it rolled toward the hangars. "Kid, you know what your problem is. You think flying is about reflexes and aggression. Kira Volkov has forgotten more about aviation than you'll ever learn." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "With respect, sir, the Air Force is changing. We need pilots who can adapt to new technology, new tactics. The old ways." "The old ways," Hawk interrupted, his voice carrying an edge that made the younger man straighten, "are what kept people like me alive long enough to teach people like you. Raven didn't get that call sign because it sounded cool. She got it because she could see death coming from 20 miles away and had the skill to dance with it." The colonel's gaze moved to the squadron duty board, where names and missions were listed in neat columns. Kira's name appeared only once, listed for basic proficiency training. Meanwhile, the younger pilots were assigned to combat air patrol, close air support, and advanced tactical training. The message was clear. She was being managed out. "Sir, the new F-35 systems are completely different from anything she trained on," Morrison persisted. "The helmet-mounted display, the sensor fusion, the stealth capabilities. It's like learning to fly all over again." Hawk turned to face the young lieutenant, his expression thoughtful. "You know what the difference is between a good pilot and a great one. A good pilot can handle any aircraft when everything's working perfectly. A great pilot can save your life when everything goes to hell." Through the radio speaker, they could hear the routine chatter of pilots preparing for the day's missions. Call signs like Viper, Razor, and Phantom traded jokes and technical information with the easy confidence of young warriors who'd never faced real adversity. Their voices carried the unmistakable sound of men who believed in their own invincibility. "Tower Viper 2-3 ready for departure. Let's go make some noise." Hawk keyed his microphone. "Viper 2-3 tower cleared for takeoff. Fly safe." As the F-35 accelerated down the runway, its afterburner painting the desert air with heat distortion, Hawk found himself thinking about the nature of respect. In his experience, it came in two forms: the kind you demanded and the kind you earned. The young pilots demanded respect based on their technology, their training, their supposed superiority. But respect earned through competence, through grace under pressure, through the simple act of doing the job better than anyone else. That was something else entirely. He looked at his watch. 8:47 hours. In 93 minutes, mechanical failure would transform routine training into life-or-death crisis. When that moment came, when the textbook answers failed and only raw skill mattered, they'd learn the difference between flying and surviving. The morning briefing room buzzed with the controlled chaos of pre-flight preparation. Kira sat in the back row, her flight suit crisp and professional, watching as the younger pilots dominated the conversation with their usual mixture of technical jargon and barely concealed competition. The briefing officer, Major Reynolds, ran through the day's weather conditions and airspace restrictions with practiced efficiency. Visibility unlimited, winds light and variable, temperature climbing to 105 degrees, Reynolds announced. Standard training profile for all aircraft. Raven 17, you're cleared for pattern work and basic maneuvers in Area 7. Kira nodded acknowledgement, noting the subtle segregation. While the others were assigned to challenging tactical exercises, she was relegated to what amounted to glorified taxi practice. The message was clear. Stay out of the way while the real pilots did the real work. Viper 2-3, you're leading a four-ship formation exercise, Reynolds continued. Razor, Phantom, and Blade, you're on his wing. Work on coordinated attacks against ground targets. The chosen pilots exchanged confident grins. This was the kind of mission that built reputations, the kind that appeared in fitness reports and promotion recommendations. Kira had flown hundreds of similar sorties, had led formations into actual combat over the skis of Afghanistan and Iraq. But that was ancient history now, irrelevant to the new generation. "Any questions?" Reynolds asked, his gaze sweeping the room. Viper raised his hand. "Sir, what's the row for the exercise? Are we simulating actual combat parameters?" "Negative. This is training only, but push yourselves. The enemy won't give you second chances." As the briefing concluded and pilots began filing out, Kira overheard fragments of conversation that cut deeper than any official reprimand. "Can you believe they're still letting her fly?" one voice whispered. "I heard she failed her last proficiency check." Another added, "My dad flew with guys like that. They never knew when to quit." The words stung because they contained just enough truth to hurt. She hadn't failed her proficiency check, but she'd been required to repeat certain maneuvers. Her scores, while passing, weren't the flawless marks she'd once achieved routinely. Age was a cruel enemy, stealing reaction time in milliseconds, degrading night vision by degrees, making every flight a small battle against entropy. But what the young pilots didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that experience was also a kind of knowledge. The ability to read an aircraft's mood through the seat of your pants, to sense trouble before the instruments caught it, to find solutions that weren't in any manual. These weren't skills that could be taught in a classroom or programmed into a computer. They were earned through years of flying, through mistakes survived and lessons learned. Outside the briefing room, the desert sun climbed higher, its heat already beginning to shimmer off the tarmac. Ground crews worked with practiced efficiency, preparing aircraft for the day's missions. In Hangar 3, a maintenance technician named Rodriguez was about to make a small mistake, a hydraulic line not quite tight enough, a connection that would hold for 90 minutes before failing catastrophically. But for now, all was routine. Kira walked toward her aircraft, her helmet bag slung over her shoulder, her mind already shifting into the focused state that flying required. She had no way of knowing that this would be the day everything changed. The pre-flight inspection was ritual and necessity combined, a careful dance of hands and eyes that had become second nature over 2 decades of military flying. Kira moved around the F-16 with methodical precision, checking control surfaces, inspecting intake screens, verifying that every external component was exactly as it should be. The aircraft sat gleaming in the morning sun, 30,000 pounds of aluminum and titanium and cutting-edge technology waiting to be awakened. Morning Colonel called out Staff Sergeant Martinez, the crew chief assigned to her aircraft. At 28, he was young enough to be her son, but he showed her the kind of professional respect that had become increasingly rare. She's ready to go. Fresh fuel, all systems green. Thanks, Sergeant. Any issues I should know about? Nothing major. There was a small hydraulic leak yesterday, but Rodriguez fixed it. New O-ring, good as new. Kira nodded, making a mental note to pay extra attention to the hydraulic system indicators during flight. Small leaks had a way of becoming big problems at the worst possible moments. She completed her walk-around inspection, checking tire pressure, examining the air-to-air missiles mounted on the wing pylons, ensuring that every detail met the exacting standards that kept pilots alive. The cockpit was her sanctuary, the one place where age and politics and career trajectory didn't matter. Here, she was simply a pilot, connected to her aircraft through thousands of hours of shared experience. Her hands moved across the startup checklist with practiced efficiency. Master switch on, fuel pumps activated, engine parameters monitored as the General Electric F-110 turbofan spooled up to idle. Raven 17, ground control, taxi to runway 27 for departure. Ground, Raven 17, taxi to 27. She released the parking brake and applied gentle pressure to the rudder pedals, guiding the fighter toward the runway. The aircraft responded with the kind of precision that came from perfect maintenance and expert piloting. As she taxied past the other aircraft, Kira couldn't help but notice the newer F-35s with their angular stealth geometry and advanced avionics. The pilots inside those cockpits had access to technology She could barely imagine helmet-mounted displays that projected information directly onto their visors, sensor systems that could track dozens of targets simultaneously, stealth capabilities that made them nearly invisible to enemy radar. But technology, she knew, was only as good as the human using it. And humans were fallible creatures, prone to overconfidence and susceptible to the kind of panic that could turn a manageable emergency into a fatal mistake. Raven 17 tower cleared for takeoff. Fly safe. Tower Raven 17 rolling. She pushed the throttle forward, feeling the familiar surge of power as the afterburner engaged. The F-16 accelerated down the runway with the kind of authority that never got old, the desert landscape blurring past as she lifted off into the clear Nevada sky. At 500 feet, she retracted the landing gear and began her climb toward the assigned training area. Below, the base grew smaller, becoming a collection of geometric shapes scattered across the desert floor. Above, the sky stretched endlessly blue, unmarked by clouds or contrails. It was perfect flying weather, the kind of day that made her remember why she'd chosen this profession in the first place. In exactly 73 minutes, that perfect sky would become her battlefield. At 15,000 feet, Kira leveled off and began the series of maneuvers that constituted her assigned training profile. Basic aerobatics, weapons system checks, communication procedures, the kind of routine exercises that kept pilots current but rarely challenged their skills. She flew each maneuver with textbook precision, her movements smooth and controlled, her aircraft responding to her inputs with mechanical perfection. Raven 17, this is Nellie's control. How's the flying today? Nellie's control, Raven 17. Clear skies and smooth air. Just another day at the office. But even as she spoke the words, Kira felt a nagging sense of unease. 22 years of flying had taught her to trust her instincts, to pay attention to the subtle signals that preceded trouble. There was nothing wrong with her aircraft. All systems showed green. All parameters were within normal limits. Yet something felt off, a barely perceptible change in the way the controls responded, a subtle shift in the engine's harmonics that wasn't quite right. She checked her instruments again, scanning each gauge and display with the kind of systematic attention that had become second nature. Fuel quantity normal, hydraulic pressure normal, engine temperature and RPM within acceptable ranges, oil pressure steady. Yet the feeling persisted, a pilot's sixth sense that had saved her life on more than one occasion. Nellie's control, Raven 17. Request permission to run full systems check. Raven 17, Nellie's control, approved. Report when complete. She began a methodical evaluation of every system, cycling through hydraulic pumps, testing flight control responses, monitoring engine parameters under various power settings. Everything checked out normally, yet the unease remained. It was like trying to identify a sound that was just at the edge of hearing, present but not quite definable. Miles away, in the control tower, Colonel Brennan watched the radar display that showed Kira's aircraft as a small blip moving through the designated training area. Her flight path was precise. Her altitude and heading changes smooth and professional. To all outward appearances, it was a routine training flight conducted by a competent pilot. But Brennan knew better. He'd seen enough emergency situations to recognize the signs of a pilot who sensed trouble before the instruments caught it. The request for a systems check wasn't unusual, but the timing suggested something more than routine paranoia. "Morrison, pull up Raven 17's maintenance records," he ordered. "I want to know about every repair, every inspection, every component that's been touched in the last month." The young lieutenant's fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing the digital maintenance logs that tracked every aspect of the aircraft's condition. "Sir, looks like routine maintenance. Oil change, tire rotation, hydraulic system inspection. Nothing out of the ordinary." "What about that hydraulic leak Martinez mentioned?" "Here it is. Minor leak in the auxiliary hydraulic system, repaired yesterday by Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. Replaced O-ring, system tested and returned to service." Brennan nodded, but his concern didn't diminish. In his experience, the most dangerous failures were often the ones that looked routine on paper. A small leak could indicate a larger problem, a component under stress that might fail catastrophically without warning. "Keep monitoring her flight. If anything seems unusual, I want to know immediately." Through the radio, they could hear the routine chatter of the other pilots as they conducted their formation exercises. The young voices were confident, professional, focused on the technical aspects of their training. But underlying their communication was an assumption that had become endemic in the modern military: that technology would always work, that systems would always function as designed, that the safety nets built into every aircraft would always be there when needed. Kira had learned long ago that such assumptions could be fatal. In the unforgiving environment of military aviation, survival often came down to the ability to adapt when the impossible became inevitable. At 10:17 hours, the impossible began with a sound that was barely audible above the engine noise, a faint grinding that lasted less than 2 seconds before disappearing entirely. Most pilots would have dismissed it as normal mechanical noise, the kind of random sound that complex machines make during normal operation. But Kira had learned to distinguish between the countless normal sounds her aircraft made and the ones that meant trouble. She immediately began another systems check, this time focusing on the hydraulic system where the earlier leak had been repaired. The gauges showed normal pressure in both primary and backup systems, but she could feel a subtle change in the way the flight controls responded. The stick felt slightly heavier, requiring fractionally more force to achieve the same control inputs. Nellie's control, Raven 17. I'm experiencing some unusual flight control characteristics. Request vectors to return to base. Raven 17, Nellie's control. Can you be more specific about the nature of the problem? Control feels slightly sluggish. Could be early stages of hydraulic issue. All gauges reading normal, but I'd rather have maintenance take a look. It was the kind of professional judgment call that separated experienced pilots from rookies. Rather than pressing on and hoping the problem would resolve itself, Kira was exercising the kind of caution that had kept her alive through 2 decades of flying increasingly complex aircraft. Raven 17 approved. Turn left heading 090, descend to 5,000 feet. You're cleared direct to Nellie's. As she began her turn toward home, Kira felt the flight controls stiffen further. What had begun as a subtle change was becoming more pronounced, requiring increasing amounts of force to maintain controlled flight. The hydraulic pressure gauges still showed normal readings, but she could sense the system struggling to maintain adequate flow. Nellie's control, Raven 17. Flight control situation is deteriorating. I'm declaring a precautionary emergency. The words seemed to hang in the air, transforming what had been a routine training flight into something entirely different. In the control tower, Colonel Brennan immediately stepped to the radio console, his expression grim. Raven 17, Nellie's control. Emergency declared. All other aircraft clear the airspace. Raven 17, state your intentions. Nellie's control. I'm going to try for a straight-in approach to runway 27. If the controls fail completely, I may need to eject. Through the radio, they could hear the controlled tension in her voice. This was a pilot who understood the gravity of her situation, but wasn't allowing fear to cloud her judgment. She was flying the aircraft, not letting it fly her. Raven 17, understand. Emergency equipment is rolling. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited. You're cleared for any approach you need. 23 miles from Nellie's Air Force Base, at 5,000 feet above the Nevada desert, Kira Volkov was about to face the greatest challenge of her flying career. The hydraulic system that controlled her aircraft's flight surfaces was failing progressively, and she was running out of options. But she was also exactly where she belonged. The hydraulic failure progressed with the relentless inevitability of a nightmare. What had begun as subtle changes in control response was rapidly becoming a fight for basic aircraft control. Kira could feel the F-16 becoming increasingly sluggish, requiring ever greater control inputs to maintain level flight. The gauges still showed adequate pressure, but she knew the readings were lying somewhere in the complex network of hydraulic lines and actuators. The system was bleeding away its life force. Nellie's control, Raven 17. I'm losing hydraulic pressure rapidly. Controls are becoming increasingly unresponsive. Raven 17, Nellie's control. How much control authority do you have remaining? Kira tested the controls carefully, feeling for the limits of what her aircraft could still accomplish. The stick required almost twice the normal force to achieve basic maneuvers, and the response was becoming dangerously sluggish. A normal approach and landing would require precise control inputs that were rapidly becoming impossible. Control, I'd estimate about 60% control authority and decreasing. I'm going to need to make this approach count. I may not get a second chance. In the control tower, the atmosphere had shifted from routine to crisis. Colonel Brennan stood at the radio console, his 25 years of experience telling him that they were about to witness either a masterful display of airmanship or a tragedy. Around him, controllers and supervisors moved with the practiced efficiency of professionals who had trained for this moment, but hoped never to face it. "Sir, emergency equipment is in position," reported the duty officer. "Fire trucks, ambulances, and crash recovery teams are standing by." Brennan nodded, his eyes fixed on the radar display that showed Kira's aircraft as a slowly moving blip, 18 miles out and descending. Behind that electronic symbol was a human being fighting for her life, using every skill she'd acquired over 2 decades of flying to bring 30,000 pounds of crippled aircraft safely to Earth. Raven 17, be advised the gear may not extend normally with hydraulic failure. Do you want to try a belly landing? Negative control. I'm going to try manual gear extension. If I can get the gear down and locked, I can make a normal approach. The manual gear extension was a backup system that used stored nitrogen pressure to force the landing gear into position. It was reliable but not foolproof, and it required careful coordination of airspeed, altitude, and control inputs. Most importantly, it could only be attempted once. If it failed, the pilot was committed to a belly landing. Raven 17, understand. You're cleared for manual gear extension. Kira reduced power and slowed the aircraft to the precise speed required for gear extension. With her left hand, she located the manual gear extension handle, a bright red T-handle that she'd practiced finding blindfolded but had never used in actual flight. The handle was stiff, requiring considerable force to pull, but it moved smoothly once she overcame the initial resistance. The sound of the gear extending was different from normal, louder, more violent. as high-pressure nitrogen forced the landing gear into position without the assistance of the failed hydraulic system. She felt the aircraft shudder as the gear locked into place, the sudden increase in drag requiring a corresponding increase in engine power to maintain airspeed. Nellie's control, Raven 17. I have 3 green lights. Gear appears to be down and locked. Raven 17, Nellie's control. Confirmed, gear appears down from our vantage point. You're cleared for straighten approach, runway 27. But even as she lined up for final approach, Kira could feel her control situation continuing to deteriorate. The aircraft was now requiring maximum control inputs to maintain basic flight, and she knew that she was approaching the limits of what was physically possible. At 12 miles from the runway, flying on skill and determination, she was about to attempt the most challenging landing of her career. The final approach was a study in controlled desperation. Kira had to use nearly full control deflection just to maintain heading, her aircraft wallowing through the desert air like a wounded bird. The normal precision of an F-16 approach was impossible. Instead, she was making constant corrections, fighting to keep the aircraft pointed toward the runway while managing an increasingly unresponsive flight control system. Raven 17, Nellie's control. Your approach looks good. Maintain current heading and descent rate. But Kira could feel the aircraft wanting to roll left, requiring constant right stick input to maintain wings level. The hydraulic system was failing in stages, different components losing pressure at different rates, making the aircraft's behavior increasingly unpredictable. What worked one moment might not work the next. Control. I'm having difficulty maintaining lateral control. The aircraft wants to roll left. Raven 17, understand. Emergency equipment is standing by. You're doing great. At 8 miles from the runway, Kira faced a pilot's worst nightmare. The aircraft suddenly lurched to the left, requiring full right stick and rudder to prevent a fatal roll. The hydraulic system was now operating at minimal capacity, barely able to move the flight control surfaces that kept the aircraft controllable. Nellie's control, I'm losing it. Controls are barely responding. Raven 17, you're still on glide path, 5 miles from touchdown. The runway was visible now, a thin line of concrete shimmering in the desert heat. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a routine visual approach, the kind she'd performed thousands of times. But nothing about this situation was normal. She was flying an aircraft that was rapidly becoming unflyable, using every technique she'd ever learned to maintain just enough control to reach the runway. 4 miles, Raven 17, looking good. The aircraft lurched again, this time more violently. Kira felt the stick go suddenly heavy in her hands, requiring both hands and maximum effort to maintain control. The hydraulic system was now operating on fumes, providing just enough pressure to keep the aircraft marginally controllable. 3 miles, you're going to make it. But at 2 miles from the runway, the inevitable happened. The remaining hydraulic pressure finally bled away completely, and the flight controls became dead weight in her hands. The aircraft immediately began to roll left, accelerating into what would become a fatal spin unless she could regain control. Nellie's control, I've lost all hydraulic pressure. Controls are unresponsive. Raven 17, recommend immediate ejection. For a split second, Kira's hand moved toward the ejection seat handle. It would be the safe choice, the by-the-book response to an uncontrollable aircraft. But ejection over populated areas carried its own risks, and her aircraft was loaded with fuel and ordnance that could cause massive damage if it crashed into the base. Negative control. I'm going to try to get her down. What happened next would be talked about in aviation circles for decades to come. Using only engine power and rudder control, Kira began fighting to regain control of her aircraft. It was a technique that existed more in theory than practice, requiring precise throttle management and rudder inputs to maintain flight without hydraulic assistance. The aircraft was now less than a mile from the runway, rolling uncontrollably but still moving in roughly the right direction. In the control tower, Colonel Brennan held his breath as he watched the most remarkable display of airmanship he'd ever witnessed. "Jesus Christ," whispered one of the controllers. "She's actually doing it." The runway threshold flashed beneath Kira's aircraft at 200 knots, much faster than normal landing speed, but the minimum required to maintain control. She had one chance to get this right, one opportunity to use every skill she'd acquired over 2 decades of flying. The aircraft hit the runway hard, bounced once, then settled onto the concrete with a screech of rubber and the roar of reverse thrust. Raven 17, Nellie's control. Outstanding job. Are you okay? For a moment there was only static on the radio. Then Kira's voice came through, shaky but triumphant. "Control, Raven 17, I'm down and safe." That was interesting. As her aircraft rolled to a stop on the runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles, Kira Volkov had just accomplished something that would rewrite the textbooks on emergency procedures. She had landed a fighter aircraft with complete hydraulic failure, using only skill, experience, and the kind of judgment that couldn't be taught in any classroom. The young pilots who had dismissed her as too old, too slow, too out of touch with modern aviation, were about to learn a lesson about the difference between flying and surviving. Emergency vehicles surrounded the F-16 as it finally came to rest, their red and blue lights strobing across the desert landscape. Fire trucks positioned themselves strategically around the aircraft, while paramedics and crash rescue specialists prepared for the worst. But as the canopy opened and Kira climbed down from the cockpit, it became clear that she had emerged from the ordeal essentially uninjured. "Colonel Volkov, are you hurt?" called out the senior paramedic, a weathered sergeant named Williams who had seen enough crashes to recognize a miracle when he witnessed one. "I'm fine, Sergeant. Just glad to be on the ground." Her voice was steady, professional, but Williams could see the slight tremor in her hands that indicated just how close she'd come to disaster. Colonel Brennan arrived at the scene within minutes, his staff car kicking up dust as it skidded to a halt near the aircraft. He approached Kira with the kind of expression that mixed relief with professional admiration. "Raven, that was the most impressive piece of flying I've ever witnessed. How the hell did you manage to land that aircraft?" Kira removed her helmet, revealing hair dampened with sweat and eyes that held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had just faced death and emerged victorious. 22 years of flying, sir, plus a little luck and a lot of stubborn refusal to give up." The maintenance team was already swarming over the aircraft, tracing the hydraulic lines to identify the source of the failure. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the technician who had repaired the previous leak, looked particularly concerned as he examined the system he had worked on just 24 hours earlier. "Sir, I found the problem," he called out to Colonel Brennan. "The auxiliary hydraulic line failed at the junction I repaired yesterday. The O-ring held, but the fitting itself cracked under pressure." Brennan nodded grimly. It was the kind of failure that could happen to any aircraft, the result of metal fatigue and stress that accumulated over thousands of hours of operation. No amount of inspection or maintenance could prevent every possible failure, which was why pilot skill and judgment remained the ultimate safety net. "Rodriguez, this isn't on you. These things happen. What matters is that Colonel Volkov brought the aircraft home safely." As word of the successful emergency landing spread throughout the base, pilots and ground crew began gathering around the aircraft. The young pilots who had been dismissive of Kira's abilities just hours earlier now looked at her with something approaching awe. What she had accomplished was the kind of feat that became legend, the sort of story that would be told and retold wherever military pilots gathered. Lieutenant Morrison, the controller who had been so dismissive that morning, approached hesitantly. "Colonel, I just wanted to say, what you did out there, I've never seen anything like it." Kira looked at the young officer, seeing in his face the same mixture of respect and humility that she had once felt when observing the achievements of her own mentors. "Morrison, you know what the real lesson is here. It's not about age or experience or any of that. It's about never giving up, never accepting that a situation is hopeless. The aircraft wanted to kill me today, but I refused to let it. The crowd around the aircraft was growing, drawn by the magnetic pull of witnessing something extraordinary. Pilots who had been conducting routine training exercises were now standing in respectful silence, studying the aircraft that had just defied the laws of aerodynamics and probability. The F-16 sat motionless on the tarmac, its battle scars invisible to the untrained eye, but representing a victory that transcended mere mechanical achievement. "Viper 2-3 to tower," crackled the radio. The young pilot's voice had lost its earlier cockiness, replaced by something approaching reverence. "Request permission to return to base immediately. I want to see this for myself." Viper 2-3 tower, cleared for immediate return. Join the pattern when able. As the other pilots began arriving back at base, abandoning their training exercises to witness the aftermath of Kira's miraculous landing, a subtle shift began to occur in the base's social dynamics. The same pilots who had whispered about her age and diminished capabilities now found themselves reconsidering their assumptions about what constituted real flying skill. "Ma'am," said a young captain named Stevens, his voice carrying genuine respect for the first time since Kira had arrived at Nellie's. "I've been flying F-16s for 3 years, and I can't imagine how you maintained control without hydraulics. The sim training never prepared us for anything like that." Kira studied the young pilot's face, seeing the kind of hunger for knowledge that she remembered from her own early days. "Captain, the simulators can teach you procedures, but they can't teach you to feel what the aircraft is telling you. That comes from hours in the cockpit, from learning to listen to sounds that aren't supposed to be there, from understanding that every aircraft has its own personality." "How do you learn that kind of awareness?" asked another pilot, Lieutenant Collins, who had been one of the most vocal critics of keeping older pilots in active service. "You don't learn it overnight," Kira replied. "It comes from flying in all kinds of weather, in all kinds of conditions, from making mistakes and surviving them, from understanding that the aircraft is trying to communicate with you constantly, through vibrations, through sounds, through the way the controls feel in your hands." Colonel Brennan watched the impromptu gathering with satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of learning moment that formal training could never replicate. The young pilots were discovering that real competence wasn't about age or technology, but about the accumulated wisdom that came from years of professional experience. "Raven," he said, approaching the group, "I think we need to have a serious conversation about your role here at Nellie's. Your performance today demonstrates capabilities that we'd be foolish to waste." The implications were clear. Instead of being managed toward retirement, Kira was about to be recognized for what she truly was, a master pilot whose skills were invaluable for training the next generation. The emergency landing had transformed her from an aging relic into a living textbook of advanced airmanship. As the desert sun climbed higher and the immediate crisis passed, the real impact of the morning's events began to settle in. A routine training flight had become a defining moment, not just for Kira Volkov, but for every pilot who had witnessed her refusal to accept defeat. The debriefing room was packed beyond capacity, with pilots standing along the walls and crowding around the central table where Kira sat with Colonel Brennan and the base flight surgeon. What had begun as a routine post-incident interview had evolved into something resembling a master class in emergency procedures. The young pilots who had dismissed her competence just hours earlier now hung on every word, desperate to understand how she had accomplished the impossible. The first indication of trouble was auditory, Kira explained, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had processed the experience and extracted its lessons. A grinding sound that lasted maybe 2 seconds. Most pilots would have ignored it, but I've learned to pay attention to sounds that don't belong. How do you distinguish between normal mechanical noise and something that indicates trouble? Asked Captain Stevens, his pen poised over a notebook as if he were taking notes from a master instructor. Experience, Kira replied simply. After 22 years, you develop an intimate relationship with your aircraft. You know what it sounds like when it's happy, when it's stressed, when it's trying to tell you something's wrong. That relationship isn't something you can learn from a manual. Lieutenant Morrison, the controller who had been so dismissive earlier, raised his hand hesitantly. Colonel, when you lost complete hydraulic pressure, why didn't you eject? The book says that's the appropriate response to an uncontrollable aircraft. Kira looked at the young officer thoughtfully. Morrison, the book is written by people who have never been in that situation. When you're actually there, with seconds to make a decision, you realize that the book assumes perfect conditions and textbook scenarios. Real emergencies are messier, more complex. But you were overpopulated areas, pressed another pilot. Ejection would have been safer for you. Safer for me, maybe. But that aircraft was loaded with fuel and ordnance. If it had crashed into the base housing area or the nearby town, people could have been killed. Sometimes being a pilot means accepting greater personal risk to protect others. Colonel Brennan nodded approvingly. This was exactly the kind of mindset that separated true professionals from skilled technicians. The willingness to assume greater personal risk for the greater good was a quality that couldn't be taught, only demonstrated. The real lesson here, Brennan interjected, is that all your advanced avionics, all your computer-assisted flying, all your modern technology is worthless if you don't have the fundamental skills to fly the aircraft when everything goes wrong. What Colonel Volkov demonstrated today is pure airmanship. The ability to control an aircraft using nothing but skill, experience, and determination. Dr. Sarah Chen, the base flight surgeon, had been quietly observing the discussion. Colonel Volkov, from a medical perspective, I'm curious about your physical and mental state during the emergency. How did you maintain focus when faced with a potentially fatal situation? Kira considered the question carefully. Doctor, I think it comes down to training and experience creating a kind of automatic response. When the crisis hit, I didn't have time to be afraid or to overthink the situation. I just reverted to the skills I've been developing for 2 decades. But wasn't there a moment when you thought you might not make it? There were several moments, Kira admitted. But dwelling on the possibility of failure would have been a luxury I couldn't afford. I had to focus on what I could control, my inputs, my decisions, my responses to what the aircraft was telling me. The room fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. These young pilots, accustomed to aircraft that functioned flawlessly and systems that provided constant feedback, were beginning to understand that real flying sometimes meant operating at the edge of controllability, with nothing but skill and judgment as safety nets. Questions, Brennan asked, looking around the room. A hand shot up from the back. Ma'am, would you be willing to share more of your experience with us? I mean formally, as part of our training program. Kira looked at Colonel Brennan, who was smiling for the first time in hours. The request represented more than simple professional development. It was an acknowledgement that experience and wisdom had value that transcended age and technology. I think that could be arranged, she said quietly. After all, someone has to teach you kids how to really fly. The laughter that followed was warm and respectful, the kind that acknowledged a truth rather than dismissing it. In the span of a few hours, Kira Volkov had transformed from an aging pilot being pushed toward retirement into a master instructor whose knowledge was desperately needed. The desert sun was setting by the time the formal debriefing concluded, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Kira why she had fallen in love with flying in the first place. As the other pilots filed out of the room, talking animatedly about what they had witnessed, Colonel Brennan approached her with a serious expression. Raven, I owe you an apology. We've been so focused on making room for new talent that we forgot the value of proven experience. Your performance today reminded me why the Air Force needs pilots like you. Kira stood and faced her commanding officer, her posture straight and professional despite the exhaustion that was beginning to set in. Sir, I don't need apologies. I just need the opportunity to do what I do best, fly and teach others to fly. Well, you're going to get that opportunity. I'm recommending you for the Advanced Pilot Training Program. You'll be working with our most promising young pilots, teaching them the kind of skills that can't be programmed into a computer. The offer was more than professional validation. It was recognition that her career was entering a new phase rather than ending. Instead of being pushed toward retirement, she was being asked to share her knowledge with the next generation of military pilots. "There's one condition," Brennan continued. "I want you to develop a curriculum based on your experience today. Real-world emergency procedures, decision-making under pressure, the kind of skills that separate good pilots from great ones." Kira nodded, already beginning to envision the program she would create. It would be based on the hard-won lessons of 2 decades in military aviation, the mistakes she had made and survived, the close calls that had taught her to read aircraft like living creatures. "I'll need access to the simulator and permission to design realistic emergency scenarios," she said. "These young pilots need to understand that their aircraft can and will try to kill them, and they need to be prepared when it happens." "Whatever you need," Brennan replied. "After today, you have carte blanche to develop the program however you see fit." As they walked out of the debriefing room together, Kira felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from her recent flying. The emergency landing had been a reminder of why she had chosen this profession, but more importantly, it had opened a door to a new kind of contribution. The young pilots who had dismissed her as too old were about to discover that age was just a number, and that real competence came from the ability to perform when performance mattered most. They were about to learn from someone who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. The hangar was quiet in the early morning hours, filled with the familiar sounds of aircraft maintenance and the low conversations of ground crews preparing for another day of flying. Kira arrived early, as was her habit, to review the training schedule and prepare for her first formal instruction session. The program Colonel Brennan had authorized was ambitious: a comprehensive curriculum designed to teach advanced emergency procedures to the base's most promising pilots. "Morning, Colonel," called out Staff Sergeant Martinez as she entered the hangar. "The aircraft you requested is ready for today's training flight. We've rigged it with the hydraulic simulation system so you can demonstrate controlled failures." Kira nodded approvingly. The ability to simulate realistic emergencies in a controlled environment was crucial for effective training. Too many pilots experience their first real emergency during actual crisis situations, when the margin for error was zero, and the consequences of mistakes were potentially fatal. "Thanks, Sergeant. Has the class roster been finalized?" "Yes, ma'am. 12 pilots selected from across the base. Mix of experience levels, all volunteers." Martinez handed her a clipboard with the names and backgrounds of her students. Lieutenant Morrison specifically requested to be included. The irony wasn't lost on her. The young controller, who had been so dismissive of her abilities, was now eager to learn from her. It was a pattern she had seen before. Respect earned through competence was often more valuable than respect granted through rank or position. At 800 hours, the selected pilots assembled in the briefing room, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. These were the base's elite, pilots who had been chosen for their potential and their willingness to push beyond the boundaries of conventional training. "Gentlemen," Kira began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to instruct. "You're here because you've demonstrated exceptional flying skills and the potential to become truly outstanding pilots. But I want to make something clear from the beginning. Everything you think you know about flying is about to be challenged." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing a photograph of her damaged F-16 from the previous week. "This aircraft should have killed me. According to the textbooks, according to the procedures you've all memorized, this was an unsurvivable situation. But I'm here, and the aircraft is being repaired because I refuse to accept that some situations are hopeless." Captain Stevens raised his hand. "Colonel, what made the difference? What allowed you to maintain control when the systems failed?" "The difference," Kira replied, "was understanding that the aircraft and I were partners in survival. When the hydraulic system failed, I didn't fight the aircraft, I worked with it, using engine power and rudder control to maintain some semblance of controllability. That kind of cooperation isn't something you can learn from a manual." Lieutenant Collins leaned forward. "Ma'am, how do we develop that kind of intuitive understanding?" "Through experience, through mistakes, through surviving situations that push you beyond your comfort zone. Today, we're going to simulate some of those situations in a controlled environment. You're going to learn what it feels like when your aircraft stops cooperating and starts trying to kill you." The morning training session took place in the Advanced Flight Simulator, a sophisticated system that could replicate the handling characteristics of various aircraft under different failure conditions. Kira had programmed a series of progressively challenging scenarios, each designed to force her students to abandon textbook solutions and rely on fundamental flying skills. "Viper, you're up first," she announced, using the young pilot's call sign. "I want you to demonstrate a standard hydraulic failure approach." The pilot settled into the simulator cockpit with confidence, his hands moving across the controls with practiced precision. The scenario began normally, but as the simulated hydraulic pressure began to fail, his confidence quickly eroded. The aircraft became increasingly difficult to control, requiring constant corrections and adjustments. "I'm losing it," he muttered, his voice tight with concentration. "The controls aren't responding normally." "That's because you're fighting the aircraft instead of working with it," Kira observed. Stop trying to force normal control inputs and start listening to what the aircraft is telling you. It was a lesson that took hours to sink in, but gradually, the young pilots began to understand the difference between flying by the book and flying by instinct. They learned to feel the aircraft's responses, to interpret the subtle signals that indicated impending failure, to make decisions based on incomplete information and changing circumstances. The real skill, Kira explained as the session concluded, isn't in preventing emergencies, it's in managing them when they occur. Your aircraft will try to kill you someday. When that happens, your survival will depend on skills that can't be programmed into any computer. As the pilots filed out of the simulator, their expressions had changed from casual confidence to thoughtful respect. They had glimpsed the difference between technical competence and true airmanship, and they were beginning to understand why experience mattered. The afternoon session moved to actual aircraft, with Kira demonstrating advanced energy management techniques in an F-16 equipped with safety monitoring systems. Her students flew in trail, observing her methods and attempting to replicate her smooth, efficient control inputs. Notice how I'm using engine power to supplement flight control authority, she explained over the radio. When hydraulic pressure is reduced, you can use throttle adjustments to help maintain aircraft attitude. It's a technique that isn't taught in basic flight training, but it can save your life. The demonstration flights continued for 2 hours, with each pilot taking turns practicing the techniques under Kira's supervision. What had begun as a theoretical discussion was becoming practical knowledge, the kind of hands-on learning that created competent pilots. Raven 17, this is Nellie's control. How's the training session progressing? Nellie's control, Raven 17. Training is progressing well. These pilots are beginning to understand the difference between flying and surviving. As the aircraft returned to base in formation, Kira felt a sense of satisfaction that had been missing from her recent flying. Teaching these young pilots wasn't just about passing on technical knowledge. It was about preparing them for the moment when everything would go wrong, and only their skills and judgment would stand between them and disaster. The sun was setting as the last aircraft touched down, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson. In the distance, the mountains stood silhouetted against the sky, eternal and unchanging. But on the flight line, something fundamental had shifted. The young pilots who had begun the day with casual confidence were walking with the thoughtful demeanor of professionals who understood the weight of their responsibilities. "Colonel," said Lieutenant Morrison as they walked toward the debriefing room, "I wanted to thank you for today. I learned more about flying in 8 hours than I had in the previous 8 months." Kira looked at the young officer, seeing in his face the same hunger for knowledge that she had felt as a young pilot. "Morrison, the real learning is just beginning. What you experienced today was controlled training. The real test comes when you're alone in the cockpit, facing an emergency that isn't in any manual. How do you prepare for that?" "You don't," she replied simply. "You just make sure you've developed the skills and judgment to handle whatever comes, and you never, ever give up." As they entered the debriefing room, Kira realized that her career had taken an unexpected turn. Instead of being pushed toward retirement, she was being recognized as a master instructor whose knowledge was invaluable for training the next generation. The emergency landing that had nearly ended her career had instead transformed it into something even more meaningful. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm at Nellis Air Force Base. Kira's Advanced Emergency Procedures program became the most sought-after training assignment, with pilots from across the Air Force requesting transfer to participate. Her reputation as an instructor grew with each class, as students returned to their home bases with skills and confidence that set them apart from their peers. "Colonel Volkov," said Major Patricia Hayes, the base training officer, "I've been reviewing the performance evaluations from your students. The improvement in their emergency response capabilities is remarkable. We're seeing 40% fewer training incidents and significantly better performance in simulated emergency scenarios." Kira looked up from the lesson plan she was developing, pleased but not surprised by the results. "Major, when you teach pilots to truly understand their aircraft, to develop the kind of intuitive relationship that comes from experience, they become safer and more effective. It's not magic, it's just proper training." The Air Force Training Command has taken notice. They want to implement your program service-wide. You'd be looking at a promotion to full colonel and assignment to the Pentagon to oversee the curriculum development. The offer was tempting: a promotion, recognition at the highest levels, the opportunity to influence Air Force training doctrine. But Kira had learned to value substance over status, impact over advancement. "Major, I appreciate the offer, but I think I can do more good here, working directly with pilots. Policy development is important, but hands-on instruction is where real learning happens." Hayes nodded, understanding the sentiment. "The offer will remain open if you change your mind. But I have to say, watching you work with these young pilots has been inspiring. You've shown them that age and experience are assets, not liabilities." That afternoon, Kira was conducting a simulator session when the emergency alarm sounded throughout the base. A real crisis was unfolding. An F-35 had suffered engine failure during takeoff and was attempting to return for an emergency landing. The pilot was Lieutenant Collins, one of her first students. All personnel, this is Tower. We have an aircraft emergency in progress. F-35 Lightning with engine failure attempting emergency landing. Kira immediately suspended the training session and moved to the control tower, where she could monitor the situation and provide assistance if needed. Through the tower windows, she could see the F-35 approaching with one engine shut down, the pilot fighting to maintain control of the advanced but complex aircraft. Lightning 2-1, this is Tower. State your intentions. Tower, Lightning 2-1. I've lost my port engine and I'm experiencing some flight control anomalies. Requesting straighten approach to runway 27. Kira recognized Colin's voice immediately. He sounded tense but controlled, applying the lessons she had taught about maintaining composure during emergencies. She keyed her microphone to the tower frequency. Lightning 2-1, this is Raven 1-7. I'm monitoring your approach. Remember what we practiced about single-engine approaches. Maintain your airspeed and don't overcorrect for asymmetric thrust. Raven 1-7, Lightning 2-1. Copy. Maintaining approach speed and using rudder to counter asymmetric thrust. The F-35 was visible now, approaching the runway at a slightly higher angle than normal, but maintaining good control. Collins was applying the techniques she had taught, using his training to manage a situation that could have easily become catastrophic. Lightning 2-1 looking good. You're on glide path and on center line. The aircraft touched down firmly but safely, the pilot demonstrating the kind of skilled emergency handling that had become characteristic of Kira's students. As the F-35 rolled to a stop, surrounded by emergency vehicles, she felt a surge of pride in what her program had accomplished. "Outstanding job, Collins," she transmitted. "That's exactly how it's done." "Thank you, ma'am. Your training made all the difference." Later, in the debriefing room, Collins described how the emergency had unfolded and how he had applied the lessons learned in Kira's program. His calm, methodical approach to the crisis was exactly what she had hoped to instill in her students. "The key was not panicking when the engine failed," he explained. "Colonel Volkov taught us that aircraft want to be flown, even when they're damaged. If you work with the aircraft instead of fighting it, you can usually bring it home safely." Colonel Brennan, who had been observing the debriefing, approached Kira afterward. "Raven, that young man just demonstrated exactly why your program is so valuable. He handled that emergency like a 20-year veteran." "He handled it like a properly trained pilot," Kira corrected. "That's what happens when you teach people to really fly, not just follow procedures." As the day ended and the base settled into its evening routine, Kira reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed. 6 months earlier, she had been considered a relic, an aging pilot whose time had passed. Now she was recognized as a master instructor whose methods were transforming Air Force training. The young pilots who had once dismissed her as too old now sought her approval, her guidance, her wisdom. They had learned that real competence couldn't be measured in years or technology, but in the ability to perform when performance mattered most. But more importantly, they had learned that every pilot, regardless of age or experience, had something to contribute to the profession. The sky was big enough for everyone who was willing to earn their place in it. The transformation of Nellie's Air Force Base's training culture was becoming evident in ways both subtle and profound. Young pilots who had once approached flying with casual confidence now demonstrated the thoughtful professionalism that came from understanding the true nature of their profession. The change was reflected in everything from pre-flight briefings to post-mission debriefs, as Kira's influence spread throughout the base. "Colonel," said Captain Stevens, approaching her after a particularly challenging simulator session, "I wanted to tell you something. Before your program, I thought flying was about mastering the technology, about being smarter than the aircraft. Now I understand that it's about partnership, about working with the aircraft to achieve something neither of us could accomplish alone." Kira looked at the young pilot, seeing in his face the kind of mature understanding that usually took years to develop. "Captain, that's exactly right. The aircraft isn't your enemy, it's your partner in survival. When you understand that relationship, you become not just a better pilot, but a safer one." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a staff car carrying visitors from Air Force headquarters. Colonel Brennan emerged from the vehicle, followed by two generals whose presence immediately commanded attention throughout the area. "General Morrison, General Chen," Brennan said, approaching with formal courtesy, "welcome to Nellie's. I believe you're here to observe Colonel Volkov's training program." General Morrison, a distinguished officer with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades in military aviation, extended his hand to Kira. "Colonel Volkov, your reputation precedes you. We've been receiving reports about your emergency procedures training from bases across the Air Force. Pilots who have trained under your program are demonstrating significantly improved performance in crisis situations." "General, I appreciate the recognition, but the credit belongs to the pilots themselves. They're the ones who have embraced the training and applied it in real-world situations." General Chen, a smaller woman with sharp eyes and an authoritative presence, stepped forward. "Colonel, we've reviewed the performance data from your students. The improvement in emergency response capabilities is unprecedented. We want to understand how you've achieved these results." Over the next several hours, Kira demonstrated her teaching methods, taking the visiting generals through simulator sessions and flight demonstrations that illustrated the principles underlying her program. She showed them how traditional training focused on procedural compliance, while her approach emphasized developing intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior. The key, she explained as they observed a student practicing single-engine approaches, is teaching pilots to feel what the aircraft is experiencing. When you can sense impending failure before the instruments detect it, when you can interpret the subtle changes in aircraft behavior that precede crisis, you have a chance to prevent disaster rather than simply respond to it. But how do you teach that kind of intuitive understanding? Asked General Morrison. That seems like something that only comes from years of experience. It does require experience, Kira agreed, but it also requires the right kind of training. Instead of teaching pilots to follow checklists, we teach them to understand the principles underlying those checklists. Instead of memorizing procedures, they learn to think like the aircraft. The demonstration continued with actual flight training, as Kira took the generals up in a two-seat F-16 to show them the techniques she taught her students. Flying at 20,000 feet over the Nevada desert, she demonstrated how subtle changes in engine harmonics could indicate developing problems, how variations in control response could signal system failures, how the aircraft itself could provide early warning of trouble. "This is remarkable," General Chen observed over the intercom. "You're teaching pilots to use all their senses, not just their instruments." "General, instruments can fail, computers can malfunction, but if you've learned to really fly the aircraft, you can bring it home safely even when everything else fails." As they returned to base, General Morrison was quiet, processing what he had witnessed. Finally, he spoke. "Colonel Volkov, I want to offer you an opportunity. We're establishing a new advanced pilot training center at Edwards Air Force Base. We want you to head the program with full authority to develop curriculum and training methods. It would mean promotion to full colonel and the chance to influence Air Force training doctrine at the highest levels." The offer was everything a military pilot could hope for: recognition, advancement, the opportunity to shape the future of the profession. But Kira had learned to value substance over status, impact over advancement. "General, I'm honored by the offer, but I believe I can do more good here, working directly with pilots. Policy development is important, but hands-on instruction is where real learning happens." "The offer will remain open," General Morrison replied. "But I have to say, your dedication to direct instruction is exactly why you're so effective. Too many senior officers get promoted away from the work they do best." That evening, as the visiting generals departed, Colonel Brennan approached Kira with a thoughtful expression. "Raven, You realize you just turned down the kind of opportunity that most officers would kill for. Sir, I've learned that the most important decisions aren't about what you gain, but about what you choose to give. These young pilots need instructors who understand that flying isn't just a job, it's a calling that requires complete dedication. Well, your dedication is transforming this base. The improvement in pilot performance, the reduction in training incidents, the change in culture, it's all because you refuse to accept that experience doesn't matter. As they walked across the flight line, passing aircraft that represented the cutting edge of military aviation, Kira reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months earlier, she had been considered a relic, an aging pilot whose time had passed. Now she was recognized as a master instructor whose methods were changing how the Air Force trained its pilots. The young pilots who had once dismissed her as too old now sought her approval, her guidance, her wisdom. They had learned that real competence couldn't be measured in years or technology, but in the ability to perform when performance mattered most. But more importantly, they had learned that every pilot, regardless of age or experience, had something to contribute to the profession. The sky was big enough for everyone who was willing to earn their place in it. The morning briefing room was filled with an unusual mixture of excitement and nervous energy. Today marked the graduation of Kira's first formal class of Advanced Emergency Procedures training, and the ceremony would be attended by pilots from across the Air Force who had come to witness what had become known as the Raven program. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Colonel Brennan, "today we recognize 12 pilots who have completed the most comprehensive emergency procedures training program in the Air Force. These pilots have demonstrated not just technical competence, but the kind of professional judgment that separates good pilots from great ones." Kira stood at the front of the room, looking at the faces of her students. They had been transformed by the training, evolving from technically skilled pilots into mature professionals who understood the true nature of their calling. The change was visible in their posture, their expressions, their quiet confidence. "Over the past 8 weeks," she began, "you have learned that flying isn't just about controlling an aircraft, it's about partnering with it. You've discovered that your most important instrument is your experience. Your most valuable skill is your judgment, and your greatest asset is your refusal to give up when things go wrong." Captain Stevens stepped forward to speak on behalf of the class. "Colonel Volkov, when we began this program, we thought we were learning advanced procedures. What we actually learned was how to really fly. You taught us that age and experience aren't limitations, they're advantages. You showed us that the old ways aren't obsolete, they're timeless." The ceremony continued with individual recognition of each graduate, but the real celebration was the transformation that had occurred throughout the base. The culture of casual dismissal toward experienced pilots had been replaced by respectful recognition of what experience could offer. Lieutenant Morrison, now a regular participant in Kira's training programs, approached the podium. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. When you first arrived here, I thought you were just another old-timer taking up space. I was wrong. You've taught me that competence isn't about age. It's about skill, judgment, and the willingness to never stop learning." "Morrison," Kira replied, "the real lesson isn't about age or experience. It's about recognizing that every pilot has something to contribute. The young pilots bring energy and adaptability. The experienced pilots bring wisdom and judgment. The best squadrons are the ones that value both." As the ceremony concluded, Kira was approached by several pilots who had heard about the program and wanted to participate in future training. The demand for her instruction was growing, with requests coming from bases across the Air Force and even from allied nations. "Colonel," said Major Hayes, "we've received formal requests from the Royal Air Force, the Australian Air Force, and the German Luftwaffe. They want to send pilots to train under your program. This is becoming an international phenomenon." The recognition was gratifying, but Kira remained focused on the fundamental mission: training pilots to survive in an unforgiving environment. Each student who graduated from her program would go on to fly in situations where the lessons learned might mean the difference between life and death. "Major, I'm honored by the international interest, but let's make sure we don't lose sight of our primary mission. Every pilot who trains here needs to understand that what they learn isn't just academic knowledge, it's survival skill." That afternoon, as the graduation ceremony concluded and the visiting pilots departed, Kira found herself alone in the hangar with the F-16 she had landed during the hydraulic failure. The aircraft had been repaired and returned to service, but it would always hold special significance as the machine that had transformed her career. "You know," said a voice behind her, "that aircraft saved more than just your life that day." She turned to find Colonel Brennan approaching, his expression thoughtful. "Sir, it saved the career of one of the finest pilots I've ever served with. 6 months ago, we were pushing you toward retirement. Now you're the most respected instructor on the base, and your methods are being adopted throughout the Air Force." "The aircraft didn't save my career," Kira replied. "It gave me the opportunity to demonstrate what I've always known, that experience matters, that skill matters, that the willingness to fight for survival matters." "Well, whatever you want to call it, you've made a difference. Not just to the pilots you've trained, but to the entire profession. You've reminded us that flying isn't just about technology. It's about the human element that no computer can replace." As the sun set over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Kira reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The emergency that had nearly ended her career had instead transformed it into something more meaningful than she had ever imagined. The young pilots who had once dismissed her as too old now sought her guidance, her wisdom, her approval. They had learned that real competence couldn't be measured in years or technology, but in the ability to perform when performance mattered most. But more importantly, they had learned that the sky was big enough for everyone who was willing to earn their place in it. Age was just a number. Experience was a treasure. And the willingness to never give up was the most valuable asset any pilot could possess. The months that followed established Kira's reputation as one of the Air Force's premier instructors. Her Advanced Emergency Procedures program became the gold standard for pilot training, with waiting lists that stretched for months and endorsements from the highest levels of military aviation. But perhaps more importantly, she had fundamentally changed how the Air Force viewed the relationship between age, experience, and competence. "Colonel Volkov," said General Morrison during a visit to observe the program's expansion, "I want you to know that your work here has influenced policy at the highest levels. We're revising our approach to pilot retention, placing new emphasis on the value of experienced instructors." Kira nodded appreciatively, but her focus remained on the practical application of her methods. "General, I'm glad the policy implications are being recognized. But the real measure of success is whether these pilots are better prepared to survive emergencies." "The statistics speak for themselves," General Morrison replied. "Air Force-wide, we're seeing a 30% reduction in training incidents and a 40% improvement in emergency response performance among pilots who have trained under your program or with instructors you've trained." The success of the program had attracted attention from beyond the military. Civilian flight schools were requesting access to her curriculum, and aviation magazines were publishing articles about her methods. She had become, somewhat,